Welcome to the Ultimate Sync Sessions, hosted by Amelia McCloskey and powered by Ultimate Sync Access, the ultimate platform for exploring opportunities in film, TV, gaming, and advertising. Join us as we dive into the sync world with the key players who shape the industry. Welcome to the Ultimate Sync Sessions. We are joined today by a friend and previous guest, Julian Drucker. Hey, Julian, how are you doing?
Hey, Amelia, I'm doing good. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. So, Julian, before we delve into all your projects with music supervision and how it all began for you, I just want to hear a little bit of an overview just about what it is you do in music supervision and just a little bit of a summary for our listeners.
Yeah, so I'm an independent music supervisor, mainly working in TV and film. I work on a lot of indie films, documentaries and docuseries, reality sometimes, as well as scripted TV, especially with another music supervisor that I work with named Christine Greene Roe. So the two of us have done a few things together over the recent years. Right now, working on For All Mankind for Apple TV Plus with her, and then on my own, working on various indie films and docs and stuff. So that's the state of my business as a independent. And but yeah, happy to dive into anything.
Nice. And we're definitely going to delve into all of those projects. But you grew up surrounded by music, didn't you? And studied musical theatre at Yale. What are some of your early inspirations and influences?
The earliest influences were kind of a hybrid of, I grew up with my parents are classical musicians, violinist and cellist, my dad and mom respectively. So I really did grow up surrounded by chamber music, especially. My dad was in a string quartet. And I also, from my mom, more so got a really sort of broad education in classic rock and R&B and, just kind of all of the canonical artists that you would want your kid to know, the Beatles, the Stones, Joni Mitchell, Stevie Wonder, all of that. So I got a great broad education early on in music and started studying music as a amateur kid musician myself, with a piano, and then eventually writing songs in high school, mostly pop songs, and then in college, like you said, musical theater was my focus.
When you chose to study musical theatre, did you want to, say, be on Broadway? What were your aspirations then, taking that career path?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I kind of fell into that accidentally, to be honest. I was not a big fan of Broadway, even growing up in New York City. It just wasn't like as much on my radar or my taste. Freshman fall, signed up for a songwriting class, which didn't clearly indicate that it was for musical theater. And so I was expecting to be writing pop songs for school credit, which was kind of the dream. It turned out to be more entirely musical theater. But as that semester progressed, I really got into it, and then had a lot of catching up to do as far as like understanding the musical theater idiom and all of my classmates who knew much more than I did about it. But what I loved about it is especially, around that time, certainly earlier examples too, that you can apply various other musical influences into a musical theater template. And there are rules for sure, and there's stylistic boundaries, but there's room for the pop and the jazz and the R&B stuff to find its way into that. So that was definitely a big part of my journey too, is just incorporating those various influences. And yeah, I mean, I think if I could have made it onto Broadway, that would have been a dream, but I didn't have any wildly unrealistic visions of that. But when I first moved to LA, I did workshop the musical that I wrote as my senior project in LA at a theater here, and kind of like incubator after that. So I was still pursuing it, but at the same time I was getting into music supervision. So I kind of, was focusing a lot more hours on supervision at that point.
Which is also a very cool career path to take. And
Yes,
you also
definitely, yeah.
You toured the world as well with an a cappella group. Tell us more about that.
Sure, yeah, so I did, a cappella. I mean, it started in high school with a group, and then in college, I joined a group that was co-ed and jazz group, kind of did a lot of traditional jazz standards, but, with some really interesting arrangements, and with them, I toured a good amount, especially for a college group, but then, I took a year off with, the Whiffenpoofs, which is kind of like the most, perhaps, like, it has a sort of, within the acapella world, a certain cachet of just being, like, the oldest group, the most recognized. Some former groups were on, like, Gilmore Girls and on Glee, and, so there was kind of a little bit of foundation for us to really take the full year off and tour, because that had been done, every year prior to us. So, yeah, it's a year-long experience. We toured all over the world, performed, like, 250 concerts with them that year. So it was a very busy and incredible experience, but yeah, it was tiring as well.
I can imagine. That sounds awesome though. And Glee was huge, right?
It
Massive around
was.
that kind of
I wish it
time.
I know, I wish it was my group that got to do that, but it was a few years earlier. Yeah.
Yeah. And at what point did it become apparent to you that music supervision was a potential career path for you?
So I, kind of got wind of what music supervision was around that same time when I was touring, when I was, a senior in college, because obviously at that point I was starting to think about what I wanted to do. I definitely was not, um, married to being a composer. That was something that I wanted to maintain as part of my identity, but not necessarily as my full-time career. So I was thinking about sort of adjacent, career paths that at the time I was a little bit, sort of thinking, this is kind of the stable thing that I need to find for myself. Little did I know it's, not quite that, but
It's
it's,
definitely not
you know,
stable.
no, no, not at all. But it was great choice because, I love TV and film, growing up too. So I kind of, like many people in our career, I kind of saw it as the perfect way to combine my interests with music and, with TV and film, and to be a part of, another medium is exciting because you know, maybe at one point as a kid, I thought I might be like a film director, but really I never had any aspirations to be a part of, the filmmaking process until this point. I'm like, wow, that would actually be amazing. So yeah, seeing the credit in other films, for example, was a kind of a eye opener saying, "Oh, that seems like a job that maybe I could do. I need to learn more about it." I didn't know very much about it when I started, but that was kind of how I.
Do you remember some of the early music supervisors that really made you start to sit up and take notice of music supervision?
Yeah, that's a great question. Obviously I ended up, starting working for Maggie Phillips, and she was one of them for sure. I mean, I really admired her work, and I, got to read there was some press coming out at that time about her, and kind of just the field itself was getting a lot more recognition starting around 2015, 2016. The Emmy category, I think, was started around that time, maybe a year later. So I think that globally it was starting to become a little bit more on people's radars, and myself included. So Maggie was someone that she was like the very first music supervisor that I tried to connect with and did successfully, thankfully for me. And then the other was Amanda Krieg Thomas, who, I think I met before Maggie, maybe a week or two before I met Maggie, but then ended up working for a couple of years later. So the two of them would have to be the most influential for me.
You definitely landed on your feet well with those two. So let's delve a little bit into some of those projects that you worked with while working, first of all, with Maggie. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So I joined Maggie's team around the time that she started on The Handmaid's Tale. So that was definitely like the marquee show at the time. It was so exciting to be a part of that. She was also working on Legion, So I did a couple of seasons with her on that. Homecoming season 1 was really an incredible show that I feel lucky to have been a part of. What else? There was some film work as well, Juliet Naked and Isn't It Romantic and Alex Strangelove. Those, some indie films, and Isn't It Romantic was a bigger budget film. And so, yeah, it was a nice way to just be completely busy all the time with so many projects. There was probably a dozen or so projects on our plate as a team. There were 5 of us usually. So that was like a very, intense workload, but got my training wheels for sure.
So tell me about some of the main tasks that you were working on some of those projects. Were you more involved in the sourcing of the music or the clearing of the rights, or literally got stuck into anything and everything that was just needed?
Yeah, no, I mean, that was for both of the supervisors I worked for at the time, Maggie Phillips and Amanda Krieg Thomas. Both of them were super generous creatively. There was no um, real protectiveness over big spots or any particular shows. It was all fair game. So we were working with Maggie. It was like the whole team was actually working pretty much on every single project in different capacities, but we'd usually listen for every spot together. I mean, on our own, but collaboratively. And then as far as clearance, at the beginning of my time with Maggie, I didn't do clearances, but I was certainly researching rights and doing a lot of administrative work with cue sheets and with, high res files and things like that. And then I, over my time there started to kind of take on everything. And then certainly with Amanda as a coordinator, and then co-supervising on a couple of things. It was everything, pre-production to air. It was every single task that you could sort of encounter as a music supervisor, including a lot of on-camera performances that we had to coordinate, and sort of larger level conversations about commissioning original works, songs, that we'd bring in outside artists to help with, or finding composers to hire, or certainly working with the composers on the projects that we worked on, spotting sessions and all of that. So kind of everything that you would imagine was part of it. And again, really great boot camp for me as music supervisor.
100%. And weren't you tempted to want to put your own show reel forward for the composer gig?
I wasn't, because I mean, first of all, like, it wouldn't have been feasible to do that on the shows we were working on. But I think, I think I'm still fairly novice level film composer. I've done a few, but my skill set was more on the musical theater side and, on the pop songwriting side. And I hadn't, especially at that point, developed as much of a technical familiarity with writing for film. So, I definitely had those thoughts, and there were times that got to work on little miscellaneous things here and there on the composing or arranging side for projects, but it was like very few and far between, and kind of something I would do a little bit more of on the side.
And what were the main things that either Maggie or Amanda would look for when hiring the composer to score the project?
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, that didn't happen that many times over the course of when I worked with them. Like, often the composer would be hired before us or in tandem with us. But and there was, many shows where we were already deep into several seasons and had an established music team and all of that. But in the cases where we did hire composers, we were listening to reels and, deciding, like, based on prior work, what might be a good fit. And occasionally, I think there were some demos that were passed around for jobs that, in spec, just kind of like, this is what uh how we might approach this as a composer. So that factored in the few times that we were kind of spearheading that effort. But it was often the other way around.
And with the artists as well for the, on-screen performances, What were the kind of the main key components when finding the right artist? Did the director already have in mind the artist that they wanted?
Yeah, well, a lot of the time it was the cast members who, would be performing on camera just because that's the story that we were telling. So we'd be pre-recording with cast members and we'd often be overseeing all of the logistics surrounding that, which involved sometimes hiring background musicians, sideline musicians to be on screen and either miming usually to the pre-recorded track and so that involved working with the director and showrunner and producers to find the right look and the right sort of skill set that we needed. When it was not cast, there were a few times where it was like kind of a let's dream up the best fit artistically for this artists that are famous and that we know for to write. Like we worked with Margot Price on a original song for Big Mouth, for example, and she was on a short list of other artists who would have been great for that. So it was definitely like that was a kind of pursuit of like we can put forward some great names for this, and because Big Mouth had such a great reputation, we were able to work with her. Similarly, like local natives were did some covers for the Shrink Next Door, and they're a great band that was top of mind for that spot. So I think that it was a combination, like certainly our ideas based on conversations with those artists' representatives and what was realistic, combined with sometimes showrunners and directors had their own ideas of who they'd want to get, and we would just try to pursue those people as the top priority. And so it was a combination in different
Yeah.
scenarios.
And in terms of the budgets that you were given to clear music with, did you find a lot of the times that you were able to stay within budgets? And would you typically work in a way that you would see what kind of A-list type songs, first of all, you'd be able to clear, and kind of budget that you would have left over for, more indie spots? Talk us through how you would make the budget work for particular projects.
Yeah, I mean, it was totally project dependent. I mean, I think a lot of projects are budgeted appropriately, some are not, so I think sometimes that's a struggle based on what people envision the show to look like before it's actually made. Usually in a season one, that's or a limited series, that's especially difficult. But often even in subsequent seasons, budgets are cut and budgets or they're expanded and then you don't spend enough money and then it gets cut the next season. So yeah, I mean, it was always a juggling act and clearing the biggest songs just by nature of how numbers work, I guess, that was usually the factor that we had to consider the most of like, well, certainly these are going to be spots where we need to spend money because of the recognizable artists that we want. And fighting for great fees was always part of that process. Like we did a lot of just so many clearances with the same companies and same people. It was like there part of the process was just developing kind of a shorthand and a relationship with those people who knew these shows, especially the music heavy shows, very well after a while and kind of understood what we were able to offer. And then obviously, certain artists kind of come with their own territory as far as budget goes. So when that applied, working around that was important. And then, like you said, filling in the rest with indie music that where having a name artist is not as important, say in the background of a bar or what have you. Like occasionally, you'll definitely still hear recognizable songs, but a lot of the time, those are opportunities just to provide texture and background to make it feel real and vibrant. And then you can give opportunities to indie artists, which is something that I've always cared a lot about, and making sure that those fees are still good for and still appropriate for those artists, but not breaking the bank for the whole production.
And what artist or spot were you particularly excited about that you landed? With a major artist that you cleared that worked so well, out of all the projects? What scene? What artist?
That's a great question. Yeah, there was one early example, since we're talking about this kind of that phase of my career, like um, when I was working for Maggie, the show Shrill, we had a really great use of the song "Meet Me Underwater" or "Okay, Meet Me Underwater" by Jay Som. And, she's an indie artist, but certainly a buzzy one that I was super into before that show or leading up to that time. And so I pitched that song for a kind of pivotal scene in Shrill. It was an episode ending montage, and it just worked really well. And I think that was the first time for me that I felt that intense gratification of a song that I really wanted and could tell would work well, made it through all the hoops, because there's so many hoops to go through before it gets confirmed. And yeah, and so then finally it did, and it got great feedback, and I just kind of felt like that was an early and memorable example. And obviously there have been many since then, but that's one that I feel great about.
And is there any particular independent artist that you were able to either help break their career or to really help increase their fan base off the back of one of the syncs?
Yeah, I mean, we especially saw that a couple of times on The Handmaid's Tale because of how popular that show was. And we saw that in much smaller ways. Like I still see that in indie films, documentaries, things that are getting some attention, like for artists who often working with indie artists on these projects with lower budgets. That is the case where you see their numbers before the project comes out, kind of taking stock of where they are. And then, obviously there's a lot of factors, but when the project airs, if you check back a few weeks later and then their numbers are a lot higher, it's probably a part of that. I think on Love Island as well, that was a big thing when I worked on Love Island because, you know, there was limited budget actually on the US version. But so there were a lot of one stops and a lot of indie artists, but seeing those numbers before and after air is actually incredible. And some artists reached out to me too and said the Shazams they got just from the one air, one episode was crazy. And
Oh
I
yeah,
think
Love Island's huge.
that it's huge. Yeah, it was certainly week to week one of the highest rated shows, I think, and it has continued to be since I worked on it. So I think that's been a big um, sort of driver for indie artists, and I think in the UK that was
Oh,
true as
same,
well. And that's
yeah,
kind of set the
very
template
much
for
so.
us. Yeah.
Nice. And what do you feel is the biggest lesson that you learned when interning for Maggie and Amanda?
Yeah, so I started as an intern for Maggie and then continued, as her assistant and coordinating for Amanda, co-supervising, and throughout all of that, 4 years, those are the 4 years of real growth and getting to know this business. So there's so many lessons. I think on a creative level, just understanding how impactful a song can be to a scene. It sounds obvious. That's a big part of what we do, but trying a million different songs to one scene, it's something I hadn't done before working in this field, obviously. So kind of understanding that it can really change the feeling in a scene. You could pick another song that might work, it would feel different. And just kind of playing it against picture, you can feel how it could go in one direction. And then ultimately choosing the song that really fits makes a big impact emotionally. And so I think I took that lesson to heart very early on. Obviously, many lessons on the business side. I barely knew the difference between master and publishing before I started. So just kind of getting to know the music business through this particular angle, and just kind of understanding the value of copyrights and, how this is one of the main avenues for artists to make money, and just making sure that, doing everything responsibly in between the music side and the film side, just taking care of uh, our projects, caring a lot about them, taking ownership of the budgets, making sure that we get them what they need, but also making sure that we compensate artists appropriately, and how these repeat negotiations work with the majors, and just all of those things were such incredible lessons. So, not to mention, Maggie and Amanda each imparting their unique styles of music supervising onto me and learning how their processes worked. So that's been fun for me since then to kind of be pick and choose the things that worked best for me and develop my own style.
I mean, what a great experience to just be completely immersed in the world of sync, thrown in at the deep end, and just learning so much as you go and just working on such amazing projects. What then made you to then decide to step out and be like, do you know what? I'm ready to now go independently. At what point did you really feel like you were ready to do that? And what kind of challenges did you first come up against when going independent?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'd say in the months leading up to doing it is when I felt like I was starting to get ready, or as ready as I could be. At the time, like I was I was supervising projects with Amanda, so I had to credit a couple of those credits, and had been supervising separately on my own, like indie films, really low budget indie films for friends and friends of friends. So I kind of like had the experience, maybe like a dozen little films like that, of just really like understanding how to do it on my own and how to do it on a higher level with Amanda, and kind of like just realized after a while that, I had those were 4 years, right, of working with Maggie and Amanda combined, and I probably had about 10 years of actual experience compressed into 4 years, because we were always working on like dozen projects. So it was kind of a amazing education in what it means to be a music supervisor. And I'm sure, I know now, especially looking back, that there was still plenty to learn, but I didn't feel like, it was the learning curve was steep to begin with, and then it not plateaued, but it kind of like it approached like a little bit of that flattening out after a while, when you're kind of rinsing and repeating just on different projects. And so I saw the Love Island opportunity as a way to step out onto my own with like a big job to do at first. So that was my first thing that I did after leaving Yay Team, which was Amanda's company. Um, and that was a full summer, like totally exclusive commitment, for like 3 months. And then afterwards, you know, taking all of the indie stuff that I had done and just building on that. So that was, and then, I didn't know how long I'd be able to make it, to be honest. Like I was taking a big leap of faith. And I got super fortunate after Love Island that I, fell into a number of projects pretty much right away. I think there was maybe a slow month, but then pretty much immediately was working on the spinoff of 911, 911 Lone Star, with still with Amanda's team, but as an independent um, supervisor at this point. And then started working with Christine, as I mentioned earlier, on Made for Love at that point. And I picked up a bunch of like docs and indie films in those few months. So yeah, it was just like a very fruitful time, and kind of encouraged me to keep going. And I've been, definitely trying to work with that momentum as much as possible.
And how and how do you juggle like managing multiple projects at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, it can be intense when, because you certainly can't really, like, everyone knows that you're not only working on their project for the most part. I think that's understood. But you can't really discuss that, because it's just like, you have to make each project your top priority when it needs you, and that's just the truth of the matter. So often, when those top priority moments come around day day by day, you have to just work really long days and be like prepared to give your all to multiple projects. And there's a lot of code switching just sort of creatively involved in that, like going between uh quirky screwball comedy, listening for like a spot for an hour or two, and then jumping into clearances for a music documentary, or whatever it is. It's just kind of like a strange thing about our jobs where we're not always in one world at one time. And given the volume that I'd been working with Amanda and Maggie, like that was especially the case where I was going between projects, like, you know, I'd say minute to minute sometimes, writing an email for this project and then listening for a
Yeah.
spot
So
for this
you
one.
were very
Yeah,
much used to it because that's kind of how you jumped in, really, isn't it? So you
it
didn't really know
is.
much different.
It really is, and I kind of described it like being a soccer goalie and, taking target practice shots where, like, I'm just trying to field all these balls and block anything, any problems from arising, and that's a big part of it when you're working on a huge slate of projects like the 2 of them do and their teams. And for me, independently, it's a little bit less crazy, honestly, but it's still a bit of that for sure, and I'm
Yeah.
used to it, but, yeah.
Especially if, it's right down to the line and, things aren't clearing the way that you want them to clear. I mean, that on a multiple level scale is a whole different level of stress.
Yes. Oh my god, I mean, plenty of horror stories. Trying to do
Yeah.
last minute urgent clearances.
Would you
Yeah.
always have, like, option A, B, C, maybe D, E, and F? Just
Yeah,
to have some, emergency backup solutions, prepared.
yeah, I mean, I would definitely try, and, like, usually a lot of showrunners, producers, especially when you've done this over and over again, where you successfully clear things in a very short time frame, that comes to be the sort of expectation, right? So, like,
Yeah.
I think a lot of times, um, the dynamic is like we assume this is going to work until you really tell us otherwise. So there aren't backup conversations until there often aren't backup conversations until you're really down to the wire, and on my end or on the supervision team's end, like, you're definitely discussing that and you're preparing, but it's not always the direct dialogue with the key decision makers until it has to be, because everyone's hoping for the
Of
best. So
course, yeah.
yeah,
Trying any way at whatsoever to make it work, to get it over the line
yeah,
for sure.
exactly.
So, what kind of advice would you give to other aspiring, music supervisors that wanna break into this field? Because it is super saturated now. It's a tough market. Um, Everyone is now wanting to be a music supervisor or get their music into sync. What advice would you give?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's very saturated. I mean, and for good reason. Like, a lot of people have come to the field, like I said, around the time that I did, when it was starting to get more notoriety, which is great for the craft, but it comes with the territory that it's very competitive. So, the advice I talk to a lot of people who are looking for this kind of advice, a lot of aspiring music supervisors, and first off, I try to, in certain cases, demystify what it actually means to be a music supervisor, including all of the less sexy, sort of business oriented side of it. And sometimes I think that's enough to turn people away because they were expecting to be listening to music all day, and that's not often the case. So yeah, that's not necessarily advice as much as disillusioning people, but I try to advise people to, like, work in a similar way that I did, either for a established music supervisor, just to get a really sort of in the weeds education and experience and credits. Like, that's one of the best ways, I think, or in-house at a network or studio. I think that anything like that where you're working on a bunch of projects, is the goal. I think it's less advisable to just start music supervising, and it would be very difficult to do that anyway. But just to, start without any kind of mentorship or built-in infrastructure around you to do that. So that's usually the advice. Yeah.
And do you feel like, with the awards and with a lot of the projects in LA, you often see a lot of the top tier supervisors. I mean, they're amazing at what they do, right? Like the Jen Malones and obviously Amanda and Maggie.
Yeah.
Would you say it's really tough for those that are kind of working their way up the ladder, to gain the kind of A-list type projects that they're working on? Um, would you say that it's normally around the top 10% that get the majority of those, and it's quite hard to break through that glass ceiling?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I would say it's about that. Yeah, I don't know the percentage exactly, but it does feel like there's about 20 or 25 music supervisors who are doing most of what comes out in the sort of prestige networks and big films and stuff. Obviously there's sometimes I'm watching like an amazing and popular movie and I don't even know the name of the music supervisor and I'm like, "Wow, how did that happen?" I mean, and often it's I'm sure my own ignorance, but I look them up sometimes. I'm like, "Oh, there aren't very many credits. It must." You try to explain it somehow. It's I think largely who you know. That definitely contributes to your success in the business and doing good work for the people that you've already worked for and rising up with them. And, that's certainly how Maggie started and became as successful as she is. So it's those, like you said, are music supervisors who do really, really good work and they're rewarded for that. And so, but yeah, everybody else has to work as well. So there is a bit of, I think, a scramble for the 90% or, however you want to quantify it, of just trying to get the projects that are still within reach and to stay active and busy. Obviously, it's been a bit of a brutal several years between the pandemic and the strikes, and there's kind of there has been a contraction of content since the time that, for example, like I was mentioning earlier when I started on my own, when things I think were kind of towards the height of content being at a boom, that contraction began shortly afterwards. And so I think everybody's felt that. I know even the top tier music supervisors that I've talked to about it have felt it. It's just on a bit of a different scale.
And how is it now? How is it looking now? Because definitely in Hollywood, like I mean, globally, it's had a lot of knock-on effects with COVID and everything else. But obviously, with the strikes, and LA has been going through a lot of itself, with the wildfires. And I'm really sorry about that, by the way. I mean, it's just
Yeah,
insane.
there's a
Um,
lot going on.
yeah. How is it looking now? Do you feel like it's especially from the strikes, managed to recover from that? Or is it still taking its time?
Yeah, I think it took more time than probably most people expected from the strikes. And now it's hard to say whether we're yeah, I think things are definitely back to some degree in a bigger way, but like I am hearing about more projects, which is good. But I am also conscious of the fact that like the strikes, the deals that were fantastic or the result of the strikes which were rewarding to the troops that were fighting for them resulted in a contraction of business because it's more expensive to make for the studios to make the content and I don't from what I understand, which it could be at this point like different than this, but I think that the studios have not increased their overall budgets by a lot at least. And so if it's more expensive to make content, they're just going to make fewer projects. So that's kind of the sort of basic understanding I have of where things resolved after the strike. So um yeah, I think things are happening. Projects are definitely starting more and more, but but there is still this difference from what I think a lot of us were used to before that.
Yeah, definitely. What's your process for landing new projects? Do you tend to stick within your network of contacts that you already know, or you actively reach out, network, attend events? Because no matter what area you work in sync, everyone has to hustle, right? Whether you're the person pitching the music, whether you're the supervisor pitching for the projects, everyone is pitching, everyone is hustling. Um,
Yeah.
doesn't matter what level you're at, because even the top tier
No.
supervisors are all going to be, going after the same kind of projects as well. I mean, it's a small world. It's very small. What's your process?
Yeah, it's very small, like you said. I think everybody is hustling to some degree. Excuse me, to some degree. And just to touch on like the way it can also be difficult for top tier supervisors, like when I work for both Maggie and Amanda, I experienced what it was like for them to scale up their business by hiring people. So it was, you know, even if you're getting a ton of work, then you can't handle it on your own. Then you need a team, and so sometimes I think it's not even necessarily like financially viable thing to scale up past a certain point without, like, you have to just understand your own bandwidth and like what you kind of can do with a team, and uh how many people you need and all of that. Um so that is challenging on every level, and as a solo, independent person, it's like fighting for your own food and your ability to survive. And it's in a, we all live, I think, in most music supervisors live in expensive cities, and it's just like a difficult life. So but yeah, I do definitely network a lot within my own context. Like having repeat clients is something that I am reliant on at this point. I've worked on multiple projects for a lot of the same people, and then, like, someone who is like, maybe say an editor or a producer on one of those projects, makes their own film or recommends me to another director or editor they know. So it is word of mouth largely. And I guess you could say like that whole process is a bit of a passive thing. Like, I personally am not the kind of networker who's like trying to have cold calls and emails and just trying to meet every single person 5 days a week. It's just, you know I know there are people who are good at that. I just prefer to do it more naturally, and to connect with people personally, and like whether people that I've worked with before or not, having a real connection is honestly what's most important. And then if work comes from that, great. I understand it can't always. So, just trying to put myself out there. Being in the mix is important. Going to events, being visible. Like, I do think that makes a big difference. As someone who's not really active on social media, that can be challenging too. So it's like, yeah, just try to make sure that people see you and remember you. Honestly, being just there is kind of important.
And you're in the best place for it as well. I mean, like, LA is the entertainment capital of the world, you know? You're listening to the Ultimate Sync Sessions with your host, Amelia McCloskey, where the world of sync meets opportunity. Stick around for more insider insights and stories straight from the heart of the industry. So, Julian, when you went freelance, what was the biggest challenge that you came up against by going freelance, and how did you deal with that?
Yeah, there's several big challenges to being freelance. The first, the first thing that comes to mind is that you have to be able to maintain a work-life balance that feels comfortable. And previously, even though I was working, very hard and long hours and all of that, like, I could still, to some degree, turn that off because I was an employee, and I was, able to kind of like separate my life from that. And then as a freelancer, especially one who, you know, didn't set up all of the like theoretical infrastructures to separate life from work. I didn't change my email address. I didn't start an LLC. I didn't like there are ways to probably make it feel a little bit more like you're working for a company that just happens to be yourself. But for me, I was just kind of going into it with a little bit more of a casual and honestly, I think as I already alluded to, a somewhat temporary mindset because I didn't think I would be able to continue doing it for as long as I have. I kind of just was nonchalant about those structures, and I found that the challenge was turning off the work at night, for example. Like you're the last person that you're answering to as your own boss. So um, responding to emails at night might feel like you're saving yourself work tomorrow, but then inevitably, for you're just continuing a conversation that will start again tomorrow anyway. So then it's kind of like being able to just flip a switch, I think, and decide that you're done for the day. Um, I think that's kind of the main challenge that I faced.
And do you still feel like you still battle with that? Have you set good boundaries around that? Because if you have, definitely tell me how to do that.
you know,
But do you feel like you've really found that balance?
I haven't found it in like the way that I think I was expecting or wanted to at the beginning. I still do check my email throughout the day and night, but I think what I've been able to do is feel a greater sense of freedom during what otherwise would have been considered the workday so that I can like also get certain balance throughout that time and go for a run if I need to or do something that feels like I'm doing it for myself and then come back to work and even if it doesn't look like a sort of 9 to 5 type of workday, it's still something that feels a little bit more natural for me and I can be happy with that. So yeah, I guess I have found that.
And do you take your work into the weekends, or are you really quite strict on, weekends being your time, and keeping everything in the week unless it's, really, really pressing, like something going into to mix to be released. Yeah, what's your thoughts around that? Well, how do you handle that?
Yeah, I mean, similarly, I do work sometimes on the weekends, and I think that if it's urgent, I will, and like I have no problem interfacing with clients and stuff on the weekends if necessary. But when I do work on the weekends, more typically, I try to just do it for myself in the same way of like saving myself work if I have, like a lunch meeting and a event Monday night, and I want to just kind of like make sure that I can still get done everything I need to get done on Monday just by teeing myself up with some of the work on Sunday, for example. So um, that's usually what it looks like, and I try to avoid letting the people that I'm working with and for know that I'm working on the weekend, just because I don't want to set that precedent. I think those are the boundaries that are more
Yeah.
important to maintain or with other people. But again, sometimes I will do it if necessary.
And I want to delve now into a bit about some of your achievements because you were actually nominated for a Guild of Music Supervisor award for Purple Beatz. What made that project special for you, and how did it feel to, be nominated for a Guild Award?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really special project. The film is like, first of all, the main reason I think it's special to me is that it centers around music, obviously. And that's like, I'm sure a big part of why the nomination happened. And, it was music was part of the story. And that's something that I've done a couple of times now since then. But I think that that was my first project. And certainly at first as a freelancer, independently, that focused on music as the storyline, and so I just kind of had an opportunity there to make a big impact on the storytelling in a way that you can certainly do when it's not part of the storyline, but in a more integral way to just like the unfolding of that movie. And it was a challenge. It was really, low budget, and finding music that would work throughout in that style. There's drum and bass was kind of the focus, and just making sure that it felt authentic and good and real and like not cheap, like making it sound a little bit more expensive than it was. That was kind of the main challenge. And I think I did a good job with that creatively. I think that the other challenge that was kind of interesting was like sort of making sure that some of the thing I was brought on in post production for that movie, as I often am, and I think that like typically it's a better idea to bring a music supervisor on in production or even earlier. So as you could probably imagine, and I'll leave it to your imagination, there are some things that needed to be cleaned up, and on a sort of creative and legal sort of level. And I think just making sure to maintain the integrity of the movie and the storytelling while you're also covering all of your bases and making sure that it's going to work and be able to be released. That's kind of what's at stake, is being able to afford to release a movie.
Actually release
Yeah,
it legally.
exactly. So, that was kind of part of the job, and I feel proud about that as well.
And it's nice to get recognition for the work as well that you did on that fire, being nominated as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Have you ever had to really fight for a music choice that, you've really, really believed in, but didn't really get the same kind of love for it? That you've really felt, this is what I really think is perfect for the scene. And I know the director's vision is always key.
Yeah.
But have you ever really felt strongly about a particular track for a scene that you've really fought for?
Yeah, I'd say like from time to time I will, first of all, I'm always providing like options. I'm never just sort of providing one song as the answer to anything. So but when I feel pretty strongly about one of those options, I will definitely call it out as I'm delivering those ideas. Say I'm delivering 10 ideas to the director or to the editor, whatever the case may be. I will call out one or two sometimes that feel especially strong to me, just in case they overlook them for whatever reason. I think it's helpful to say something like that, or even, make notes about where to start the song in relation to the scene, and trying to advocate for a choice on that level so that you're teeing it up for success in the best possible way. I'd say like, more often than not, the fighting, it would be against choices that don't feel right versus like fighting for the one idea that I have that feels super right, because at the end of the day, I don't know exactly how it's going to play in the scene. You can tell to some degree, but it's not often we're working remotely and not really in the edit bay and figuring out kind of like exactly mechanically how it would work. So I trust when I'm working with a good editor that they'll figure out which options are the best among the ones that I have provided. I've advocated less than fought for like groups of people to be represented in certain projects. That's been important rather than fighting with like the director themselves, like just sort of being a sort of mouthpiece to other groups that I feel like might be overlooked otherwise, or for example, like on the project Justice USA that I worked on. It's a docuseries about the criminal justice system, and it's shot inside of prisons in Nashville. I was very focused on trying to get Nashville artists into that series, to represent the local music scene, which is obviously very vibrant and rich, and so that wasn't too hard, But also like especially focusing on BIPOC artists, and trying to sort of roughly mirror the demographics of the inmates that we were seeing on screen with the music that we were hearing. Things like that feel important. Like I'm currently working on a PBS special that is about Islam, and have been kind of advocating for getting Muslim artists, emerging Muslim artists into the project, which so far has not actually been the automatic choice stylistically, given what has been requested. So I'm working on that, and those are the situations where I feel like I can be a little bit more of an advocate versus when it's just like one song that I happen to think is great.
And it must be a really great feeling when you're able to have those voices heard, you know, able to represent different communities in a project, and especially when, the powers that be
Yeah.
agree with that too, and it really makes the project come alive as well,
Absolutely.
so
Yeah, that's the goal.
we really need to touch on about AI because obviously it's the talk of the industry, all industries at the moment.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of it's really interesting to hear different people's opinion about it. And I really like to hear your thoughts on whether you actually currently use AI for your day-to-day work sometimes and where you think AI is headed and how you think it's gonna affect the industry.
Yeah, it's something that does make me nervous, like a lot of people, I'm sure.
Mm.
There's some exciting aspects to it that can be helpful as tools. That's the thing, is I think it has to remain a tool for the people who are creators, more than replacing people. That's the fear. Um, so I currently have used it in a couple of instances, not often, but like the ways that I've used it are, for example, like when stems are needed or instrumental is needed and doesn't exist, like there's software that's quite good and able to separate stems through AI, and there's of course like a kind of legal discussion surrounding that, and usually it's something you would run by the label before you just assume it's good to go. But that is the kind of AI tool that I am excited about, and there are other things, within the world of music making that I think musicians who are actively doing that could speak better to as well. But like, I'm certainly not using AI generated music in my projects, and that's something that I would
Mm.
resist at all costs. And I'm sure there's also cases where stuff like that is playing in without anyone realizing it, so I think it's probably creeping into
Yeah.
our world much quicker than we necessarily know. But yeah, I think there are useful tools in specific scenarios, but it's not something that I would want to replace uh real music, of course. And also, like, the craft of music supervision itself is at risk when there's
Mm.
AI tools that can detect similar songs and provide options for filmmakers, and probably also license music without needing human interaction. And so I think that, like, our job, and certainly the people who pitch music to us, their jobs are at risk in the next few years. And I don't have an answer, but I do feel like,
I don't think anyone really has the answer.
yeah, it's definitely new territory.
It is, I think, and for everyone, every single person. And I think it's the creative industries and engineering as well, like coding and things like that, where it's like a very real
Yeah,
risk right now, isn't
yeah.
it? What do you think can be done to I wouldn't say help prevent that, but almost find a way to be able to find room for AI and for all us creatives as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure, honestly. I want there to be room for those tools to help improve workflows. And I think it needs to there needs to be some kind of, whether it's through unions and trade associations and organizations that are probably starting as we speak in order to combat the influence of AI, or just like regulate it, via the government as well. There needs to
Mm,
be some kind of
mm,
regulation in place, um,
mm,
without fully restricting our freedom to make the use of the tools that are helpful. But um, I worry about the AI generated music, as like that's
mm.
the thing where, at least off the top of my head, I haven't thought so deeply about this, to be honest, but I think that like the off the top of my head there isn't necessarily a whole lot of merit to that. Like why do we even need that? I understand it's going to be made. It's inevitable. Like people are getting better and better at this, and it's impressive. Like that, and I think it's getting better and
Mm,
better. Like we hear examples of it that, you know, are kind of scarily good, or at least scarily similar to
mm.
things that are good. But yeah, I don't really see why any human being would choose anything like that to put into their projects, for example. Or, I think probably people see it as like kind of an open source, free opportunity in many cases.
Yes,
But
and that's what I mean, like, who would own the rights?
yes. Oh, okay. I mean, gosh, I don't know. I think that in many of these cases, the tech companies that created the AI are claiming the rights. Like the CEOs of tech companies are listed as songwriters and stuff, which is kind of bonkers to me. But
Wow.
and the engineers, but and not to say there isn't like some artistic vision behind that, but I think that it's like it's just a different ballgame. It's not music making. It's like
Mm.
engineering, and not in the music sense. It's like coding.
And learning, learning and modeling what's already out there. But I guess on some level, we as humans take inspiration as well from what's already out there, don't
We
we?
do. Yeah, that's a good
Um,
point. But yeah, but it's somehow, if it's filtered through a human brain, it feels a little bit more
Personal,
personal. Yeah,
personalized.
yeah. And there is a lot of, I'm sure there's a lot of music companies, especially libraries and stuff, that are agreeing to let their catalogs be used for training machine learning models. And, so I'm sure there are ways that this is happening, quote unquote, above board. But then there's
Mm.
also probably plenty of cases where it's not. And, that's an important distinction. But even when it is above board, like what's coming out of that should be regulated, I think.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with you. So, what's your thoughts about Splice and, you know, other beat type sources that a lot of creatives use for loops and things like that? On the licensing side of things as a supervisor, and the shazamming and the ownerships and multiple ownerships, because I had a few creatives come to me and say, yeah, but now that you get, a certificate for licensing, what's your thoughts surrounding that? And would you ever take the risk, and do you license anything that sent you like from that?
Yeah. It's interesting because this is not something that I am typically privy to. Like I'm pretty sure I've probably licensed music that was created with some splice samples before. Like I think that has pervaded the major, like many producers are using stuff like that. I don't know if splice is better or worse than certain comparable sample packs, but I think that um if there is that certificate, or like I'm assuming they're all, so everyone is signing license agreements when they're buying that software that does allow them to make commercial use of their music. So I don't I don't take particular issue with it, but I'm not like asking people if this contains splice samples before licensing it. That feels like a can of worms that I really don't want to open. Because I think, that would be one example, but then there's many other similar things that you might find if you start asking that level of granular questions about how the music itself was created. Not to mention that many of our licensors wouldn't even know the answer to that. And like they could ask, but then, especially in cases of songs created a long time ago, like there's gonna be different accounts of that, and it's not gonna be like a reliable metric to decide whether or not to license music by. So I'm sure people have different opinions on this, but I also think, by the way, that there are within Splice, there's probably quite a variety of different levels of usage. Like if you're using a drum sample from Splice, that is much different than using a vocal chop that you're going to recognize, you know? So if there's a vocal chop in there that you've heard in 5 different songs and you're like, "Oh yeah, those 5 producers used Splice," then, it gets a little bit hairier because you're like, "Well, I I recognize that lyric or that sound, from this other song. Is there I don't think that other producer, even if it came first, would have a legitimate claim on the newer song, but I do think that that's when it gets a little bit, like, less, straightforward. So, probably vocal stuff is less, safe than drum hits and samples that can be tucked in a little bit more to the texture. That's just a hypothesis, but even so, like I said, I think that, it's not really a can of worms that I'm typically going into. If I were a music licenser, like, and I was signing stuff, I might take that a little bit more seriously. But, as long as somebody is warranting that they own what they're pitching and licensing, that's kind of the coverage that I would require as a music supervisor, and that the studios I work with, like that's kind of what's important. Obviously, they need to be telling the truth about that, but that's, the main criteria.
And like you say, that there are so many different opinions around it, and every supervisor works differently as well in how they approach the licensing of tracks. So, um, let's move on around trends. What are you currently seeing? I know it can really vary from project to project in terms of, the requirements and what's needed, whether it's film or TV. Is there anything that you see come up time and time again? Like vintage is always needed. And I still think it's crazy that they consider 90s as vintage. It makes me feel old, but
Yeah.
yeah. What do you see that comes up time and time again?
Yeah, I mean, vintage certainly in a broad sense is, there's a trend surrounding that in film and TV. I mean, I think that there's a couple
And ads as
in
well.
ads, yeah. And there's a couple reasons for that. Often in my experience, it's because of the period of the time period the project is taking place in, which makes obvious sense, for authenticity.
Mm.
But also in more contemporary settings, you'll still hear that because this is the music people grew up on or really love, and so it finds its way in. And then also because it has certain textures that contemporary music might not have, that basically create a feeling that you can't quite get or you might not be able to find as easily.
Mm.
So those are the reasons I think for vintage music having a lot of life, which is great. I think there's trends that I'm like less excited about that have been around for a while that, I could take or leave, like the sort of the breathy vocal covers in trailers and stuff, and the
Mm.
swagger rock, the macho, rock. And
Yeah.
so I think that, there's room to be a lot more creative, if you're making projects that in themselves are not necessarily like reinventing the wheel stylistically. Like using music in a more creative way could be a breath of fresh air. But I think the other thing about vintage music, and this applies to not only vintage, but a variety of music that is not like kind of pop or what we in the broad sense, like, including hip hop and including R&B, anything that kind of appears in contemporary radio. I feel like there's a little bit of a people will refer to scenes or music within scenes as being quirky when it doesn't like quite feel expected. And I think that there's a great creative impulse there, but I think that the term is maybe a bit of a misnomer and a little, just potentially offensive to the musicians who were making music earnestly. But like that includes foreign language lyrics where you might not expect them, and I think that the trend though is valid and very cool to like make use of that stuff when it feels unexpected and interesting. Um, there's, of course, classical music often being used for scenes where you want to create a lot of drama or be over the top and or in an elegant setting, playing as source music. And again, I think that there's room to be more creative where like that's not always just the best way to tell that part of the story, but I think a lot of people just default to it based on their view of classical music. And it can be used in much more interesting ways. Like, I watched A Real Pain, for example, recently, and that was wonderful use of Chopin all over the film. I think there's room to use classical music in a more intentional and interesting way. So those are my thoughts on like some of the trends that I've seen um, and why I think it's interesting, but there's ways to like possibly break out of some of the well trodden paths there.
And I'd really like to delve into some of the complexities around public domain.
Yeah.
When needing to license public domain tracks, what are your thoughts surrounding that? Because obviously the publishing, is within public domain, but obviously you got the master side of things, and there are actually more complexities to it than people realize. So I just want to discuss a bit about that side of things when you have to clear public domain stuff.
Yes, definitely it's more complex than I think people realize, and so that can end up becoming a kind of thorny thing to deal with. There's definitely the master side, which is rather straightforward, as you would expect to license any master recording of a public domain piece. It would happen the same way as with a non-public domain piece, the master side. And then the publishing is either properly public domain or there's an arrangement which could be copyrighted. And the arrangement might be by the performer, it might be by an actual arranger who, rearranged the instrumentation of the original piece for a different ensemble, or, there's various nuances to that. But that arrangement can be copyrighted at any time after it becomes public domain. And that's where I think people fall into a trap sometimes, is not realizing that, assuming everything's public domain about the publishing and then making use of it without licensing that arrangement. And then of course there's also the issue of territory, where public domain is not the same in every territory, in every country. The rules that surround public domain and the amount of time that needs to pass after both the creation of the work and the death of its authors. So, most of the projects in our globalized world these days are going to need to be viewable worldwide and distributed worldwide. So all of the requirements for public domain are typically that it is public domain worldwide versus just in the United States, for example, which is a shorter term than certain other countries. So just being mindful of that, like making sure that you're not trusting unreliable sources online that say it's public domain, just because it might mean public domain in the US. Um, yeah, so it's a lot to navigate sometimes. And, there are cases where it's so unclear that you actually need to like engage with musicologists and with a studio's attorney, production attorneys, and make sure that the powers that be will bless your argument of something being public domain. So there are ways that you can sort of clear your own conscience of that when it's not like entirely obvious, but I think that you have to do a lot of research, and I've done that before. It's very interesting. I like the research part of the
Mm.
job, in general, not just public domain, but it's just something to be mindful of.
And where would you go to research some of these things, especially on the ownership side? If it's different arrangements and things like that,
Yeah, so oh,
what forms part of your research?
yeah, arrangements are copyrighted and registered much like any composition would be, or they should be at least, on like the performing rights organizations, repertories. So that's where I would start. If it's a situation where an arrangement would be where the performer would likely be the arranger and the performer owns the master, or their label is licensing you the master, then you could discuss that with them, like see if there's any label copy that the came with the recording and that indicates whether there's an arrangement, and various other ways to sort of tell. But yeah, basically just asking the people who are representing the most likely candidate for that particular recording. It gets a little bit more complicated in cases of like hymns and prayers and religious music, where you can find there are certain helpful databases online. Hymnary, I think .org is one of them that I've used a lot. That has information that dates back on a lot of these arrangements. Because what often happens in religious music is that one arrangement sort of becomes the common practice for that particular hymn after a certain amount of time, or at least within a certain geographic area. And so people think they're singing a public domain hymn, and they're right that it's a traditional hymn, but it has an arranger from the 20th century attached to it. So
Mm.
things like that are the resources that I try to start there, and then sometimes you have to go deeper. But
And this is why it's so important for filmmakers, not just filmmakers, but those that want to license public domain, to have a music supervisor that knows about these, the research side, the complexities, to ensure that everything is legal to put out.
absolutely.
Because a lot don't realize and wouldn't realize
Right.
any of
Yeah,
this.
it's not obvious, and unfortunately ignorance is not a defense. So um you know
No, many lawyers have made a lot of money from
yeah,
ignorance.
it's true. You're right.
So, let's talk about estates.
About estates?
Estates, yeah, when having to license music, from, researching and finding out, when a author has passed, and dealing with the estate, to license stuff. Let's go through the process of that. Do you enjoy having to deal with that? What are some of the complexities that you come up against with that? And for those listeners that don't come from the background of music supervision, let's also explain around why, obviously you would need to do that, to clear it, because once an owner has passed that owns the IP to that, and it can be so complex.
I haven't had a great deal of experiences where I'm dealing with the estate directly. Like, I think typically estates are managed by somebody, and that person is often represented, or that estate would be represented by a company. And so sometimes, like, when you're clearing the music by deceased writers, you're clearing it in the same way that you would be clearing it with living writers through a company. So I guess I haven't really noticed any particular complexities, other than that, sometimes the estates would have stronger creative opinions about, or would feel the need to, uphold whatever that writer's or artist's sort of values would have been surrounding a situation, and might take a little bit more of a conservative approach with that. I have seen that
Mm.
occasionally. But yeah, I think otherwise I have once or twice, I guess, dealt directly with estates and the managers of those estates. But most of the time it's just been like anything else for me, clearing living writers' music and going through their publishing companies.
what's your thoughts on a lot of investment companies buying up catalogs, private equity firms buying up catalogs now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good for the industry to have injection of capital like that, probably on a level that is harder for a music company to generate. I don't really have developed thoughts beyond that. I guess, like, I don't know if there are any moral or, other ethical concerns surrounding this, but I'm sure that some of these investment companies are not the cleanest whistles and but I guess yeah, I don't have any particular problem with it, as long as it doesn't sort of strip artists of their creative freedom and ability to make the music they want to make. And I think funding it from any source that's able to like really put value into the catalogs is great.
Do you think there might be potentially some concern over having that ownership over not having any kind of music background, that they have power over where and how music is being used without having any creative background? That could potentially be an issue.
I suppose it could be. From my limited understanding on this, I feel like those companies will buy existing music companies and allow them to operate as they previously did for the most part, and just understanding that they know the music industry better than the investors themselves. And I'm sure on a high level, like a high sort of structural level, things might change. There might be layoffs, there might be restructuring in the companies that themselves, but I am not aware of it.
Well, just owning the IP of the publishing of the catalogs that they're buying up. There's been some major deals. Thinking come to mind. I think Justin Bieber sold his, Katy Perry. Don't quote me on that, but buying out the catalogs completely. But I guess time will tell, really.
Yeah, something tells me that, those pop stars are just going to keep doing their thing and be happy to have that cash flow, but not really like, I think that money was going to come from somewhere anyway. And if those companies directly own the IP, which I'm sure is true in certain cases, then I would be more, I would be more concerned for an indie artist who is getting direct funding from a wealthy investor or a company, and that would sort of push their hand in certain creative decisions. I'm less concerned about like a Katy Perry or Justin Bieber, who I'm sure is surrounded by, like a machine of creative people, but also like, insulated by the major music companies and a management team and all of that. So I would be a little bit more concerned for indie, like sort of higher level indie artists that are like seeking out major investment dollars from wealthy people and what kind of control that could assert on their direction.
Yeah. And let's circle back round to your music supervision side of things. Where do you see, your freelancing and projects going? Like, what would be, an ideal supervision project for you to take on? Like, what are your goals with it, with where you're going?
Yeah, I am looking to take on some more studio level TV shows, scripted TV and film. So I think that's always kind of like what I'm aiming at, in addition to continuing with a lot of independent films, which I love working on, and documentaries as well. So like I kind of want my career to broaden instead of like turning into a different direction. I would love to just be able to work on a kind of little bit of this and that, and that would include trailers and some I've done a little bit of branded content recently. I like, being able to work in a different media and understand the complexities involved. And, just as a curious person, it's helpful to dip my toes into these different areas. And as sort of a career trajectory thing, I think like it's helpful to kind of diversify my experience. And so yeah, the more like ad work and even trailers and things like that I can do on top of my bread and butter with film and TV, that would be great. and, working on higher budget films and TV shows would be awesome as well. So, that's what I'm sort of working towards.
Is there any particular TV series that you would love to supervise, or a particular director you'd really love to work with?
Yeah, I would love to work on a true crime series, for example. I'm a big consumer of those.
Oh, I love true crime.
Yeah, and I have before, but I think like doing some more of that, doing like another period piece would be really interesting, like a 50s or 60s piece. Also working on a very contemporary piece where I can like really make use of music that's just come out and being on the cutting edge of new releases. That's always exciting to me, kind of featuring songs for the first time as they're released and things like that.
Like Euphoria.
Yeah.
How cool was that?
Yes.
Like contemporary wall-to-wall music done so well, right?
Yes. So, a show like that would be a dream in a way. And I am working right now on a music docuseries, and that's the first time I've ever worked on like a music doc. So that's been on the bucket list. I'm happy to be doing that. So yeah, just kind of trying to like find every corner of different types of content, because I've been doing this long enough where some of the work feels similar, and so it's nice to like start on some new territory.
Yeah. And what do you feel has been the biggest lesson that you've learned in your supervision journey?
That's a great question. Understanding our position in between the music industry and the film industry, being literally like the sort of middleman when negotiating the best rates for our projects, but also um, respecting the value of copyrights, and especially with emerging artists, giving them a chance to continue making their music. Like that's a big lesson, is just understanding responsibility. Whereas like maybe when I started, I was a little bit more cavalier about just like, oh, I get to choose music for a living. Like, how cool. But that's not entirely what this
Small
is.
part of it.
Yeah, it's just one part. And it is a big responsibility for the creative success of a project and for the sort of market place that we are a part of. And I kind of appreciate the balance of creative and business concerns, and often being in a legal position without a law background is an interesting lesson as well. Just making sure to offer as much wisdom as we can as we learn more and more about this, but also keeping ourselves free of liability, and of making sure that the end of the day counsel is coming from a lawyer, and things like that.
Exactly. And what advice would you give to those on the pitching side, aside from the obvious, like metadata and all of that side of things, and also to aspiring supervisors?
Yeah, okay. So with pitching, I think just being personal is helpful. Being like trying to develop a personal connection first, and then kind of making the most of that. And that sounds really obvious as well, but it's not the approach a lot of people take. And I think that ultimately, in my experience, as opposed to the companies that are always going to get business no matter what, like the ones that succeed often have developed personal connections with me or with my team, and we feel like we want to help them out, and that's like the kind of the best thing you can get from someone in the decision making seat. Not that we are actually in ultimately decision makers, but in place of being able to help and get the music to the finish line if possible. And then for aspiring music supervisors, I would recommend that you not only like shadow and work for more established music supervisors in order to get a better sense of what this job is really like before committing to it. But also, like making sure that this is the path that you want, because it's not an easy one. Especially as an independent, it's not a given that you're going to be able to, no matter how creative or organized or smart you are. It's a field that is still growing and defining itself. And I think that we're seeing progress with that, but it's not yet at a place like being a composer even, or being a producer of TV or film. Like there aren't as defined pathways, and it can be hard to sort of find your place. So I definitely would recommend just gaining a more thorough understanding of what this community and what this job is really like. And that if you still feel excited by it and willing to take risks in your career, that's when it's time to kind of commit.
What about composers? What would you say to them?
Yeah, I'd say composers should continue following their own voice, obviously, like creating music that feels unique to them. But if they're composing for film and TV, obviously you're serving a vision that's broader than that. But the just having something that you can feel proud of nonetheless, like working within whatever constraints you're given, but finding your own voice nonetheless, I think there is a way to do that. And I do think that a lot of the music we hear, on TV, especially like maybe less so in like quote unquote prestige TV, but in other network TV and a lot of films, like you hear stuff that sounds kind of similar. Um, and the stuff that people really notice, it does get rewarded for originality. And, I think that that's wonderful. So continuing to follow your own vision, but also managing to serve the vision of your boss on the project.
Yeah, of course. So when you say about it's important to be personable and to build connections, which goes a long way, um, what exact advice would you give for those wanting to, build and create that relationship with you and your team? In what ways would you recommend that they can do that?
Yeah, I'd say obviously, I'm in LA, and if these people are in LA, sort of finding events and opportunities to meet people in my position, that goes a long way. Like actually face-to-face meetings are still, it might sound old school, but I guess that's like, I think a lot of the forums for business coming out of that, like that's never going out of style. Like, and getting to know someone on a personal level. There's only so much time you have to invest in that, of course. Like, and I think coming from a place of sincerity is appreciated, as opposed, like, it's pretty transparent when someone is just looking to get business from you and they claim to be interested in your life. So not falling into that trap, and just focusing your
And
efforts.
you can
Yeah.
sense that,
Oh
right?
yeah, yeah.
It's really obvious. Yeah. Yeah.
Certainly.
When you know someone's not really interested in you as a person, just what they can get from you. It's yeah, it is really obvious. Okay, just to wrap up, one word you would describe just the whole music supervision industry journey. If you could sum it up in one word, what would that one word be?
Perseverance, maybe resilience, either of those.
Thank you so much, Julian. And if anyone wants to find out more about you, your projects, or even just want to perhaps reach out, where would they go and do that?
I would say the finding sort of research, and this is not just me, of course. So like looking into music supervisors' current work by checking on IMDb. I think a lot of us are maybe a little behind on those, updating those, but like that's a good way to see what's coming up. And again, like the guild is a sort of a good forum for, like, there's being a friend of the guild is an option, and you can go to the conferences and online panels and things like that, connect with people that way. So I would say, again, getting the FaceTime at events and reaching out via, like, I guess I don't really have a great way for just cold contacting, but because it's not really the most worthwhile method anyway. But just
Right.
finding people in the ways that through the channels that you can, and starting from there, and then asking them, who could you connect me with, and then sort of broadening your network that way.
Perfect. Thanks, Julian. And so, yeah, if you want to connect with Julian, definitely keep up to date with the projects he's working on. And obviously, he's already given a whole load of information on here as to the kind of projects he's working on. And get yourself over to LA, meet with him in person, and and take it from there. Thank you so much, Julian. It's been so super inspiring and educational, and I know listeners will definitely find that as well. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Amelia. I appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in to the Ultimate Sync sessions with Amelia McCloskey. To learn how Ultimate Sync Access can connect you with new opportunities, visit ultimateSyncAccess.com. Subscribe for our monthly episodes and follow us on socials for more sync insights. See you next time.